today I'm going to talk about something that I don't usually talk about in church or in my classroom, which is the plate tectonics of a new era. I'm trying to use it as an example talk to encourage more scientists to relate the research to the Christian faith. Hopefully this will be the first of many to come. As an example, I will link the splitting land and expanding sea to the Christian hope. Okay, so I have two parts in my talk. The first part I will cover the science with an introduction to plate tectonics, because I know most of you will not know what plate tectonics is. And then I will narrow it down to the story of the burns of an ocean. The second part, I'll talk about the Christian implication of this story. First, starting with a very general implication of scientific discovery. And then in the second part, I want to apply specifically to the ocean story, apply it to the spiritual journey of a Christian. And at the end, I will have a conclusion. We know that the Earth is not a featureless surface, right? We go hiking, we go sailing, we have highlands, we have mountains for us to go hiking, mountaineering. On the other hand, we have water and deep oceans for us to go sailing. So we do have a very enjoyable planet. But have you ever asked why we do have all these different elevations? The answer is by isostatic equilibrium, together with the fact that the thickness of the Earth's lithosphere changes from place to place. So in some place, the lithosphere is thicker, and in some places it is thinner. But what is lithosphere? To explain that, I have to explain the Earth's outer layers, and this figure shows how it looks like. So imagine you cut the Earth into two and you just look at it from the side. This is what you will likely to see. So we do have air. We all experience that we are living within the air layer. And then also the water is the ocean, so water. But beneath the air and beneath the water, we have a layer that is called the lithosphere. And it is composed of in the upper part, the crust, and the lower part, the mantle. So this is the crustal layer, and it is a rigid layer. And the mantle is also a rigid layer. In between them, what separates them is a boundary that is called the morphologic discontinuity. We simply call them the mohole. So basically, we have this rigid plate that is floating above a non-rigid, a soft, asthenosphere, so which is more like creme brulee. So our word is more like creme brulee. You know what creme brulee is, right? I really like creme brulee. So the crust would be like the sugar crust that we have, and the mantle. The rigid part of the mantle is if your creme brulee is too old and it becomes dry and flaky, that become your rigid part of the upper mantle, and then the non-rigid part, the flowing part, would be the more fresh, yummy custard. So this figure shows how isostatic equilibriums work. Here you can see there are three configurations of lithosphere and asthenosphere at three different locations. So in the leftmost part, it is the mountain. So example of a mountain, you have, I don't know why the arrow keeps disappearing. So at the left, you have a thick column of lithosphere above asthenosphere, and in the middle, well, to the far right, we have, this is the ocean. You have water above the sediment, and then the lithosphere. Okay, and in the middle, you have sediment all the way to the seawater level, so you don't have any water. So for all these three locations to be isostatically balanced or in isostatic equilibrium, it means that when we choose a reference height, the weight of everything above it would be equal. Okay, and how can we calculate the weight? It is this formula. So it's actually the pressure. So we have the density of each block times the height of this block and also the gravity. But because the gravity are the same, so we don't need to consider it. And for the density, the highest density would be that of the mantle or the asthenosphere, and the lowest would be that of the water, and the second highest would be the lithosphere, so this one, and the sediment. So this is how it works. So I don't have the time to really plug into real number to demonstrate how the effect of each of the parameters will change, but if you do it at home, you can do it at home actually, and you will find that the thicker the crust, the higher the elevation. That's why mountains are high, because it has a really thick crust. And so the opposite is true. The thinner the crust, then the lower is the elevation. And also another factor is the density of the crust. It's less important than the thickness, but I still want to show you because it's also a factor. So the denser the crust is, the lower is the elevation. We know that we have thick crust some part of the world and thinner crust in another part of the world, but why there are thick crusts and why there are thin crusts? And so let's start with the scenario with the mountain where we have thick crust. So the plate tectonic for this a mountain would be that when the plates are moving towards each other, it's the convergence. And you imagine like two cars crashing head-on. So the things kind of pile up in the middle, and it is kind of thickening by shortening. Another way of increasing the thickness is by building volcanoes. So the slab going down to the mantle because touch the hottest part of the mantle, so it melts and goes to the surface and build a volcano. So imagine you have a block like that. If you compress it sideways, then it will be thickened vertically and also will shorten horizontally. So that is the effect of the plate tectonics compression. And I also agree well with our observation. So you see, whenever you have high mountains, this is the rocky. This is where when it is next to the convergent margin. So when the plates are moving towards each other. The same with the Andes. The same with the Tibet Plateau, and also the Himalaya and the Alps as well. So now we move on to the ocean, where we have thinner crust. So how can the crust become thin? That is, the plate tectonic for it is when the plates are moving away from each other. So it's the extension, it's thinning by extension, and the response of the plate under extension is rifting. So it formed a fault or kind of large crack, and the land pieces just kind of sliding down the fault, making rifts like this. So if you imagine you have a block like this, and you are pulling it sideways, that is pulling it or extension, then it will be longer horizontally and thinner vertically. So that is the deformation. Another way of thinning, another way of having thin crust is to produce this thin crust. That's what happened in the mid-oceanic ridge. There we have production of thin crust as oceanic crust, and we call this process as drifting because as oceanic crust continue to be added in the middle of the ocean, the older crusts are kind of pushing sideways along with also the continental block or body, and they are kind of like traveling. So it's the drifting stage. And because the oceanic crust is thinner and also denser, it will stay low and forming the ocean because it's lower than the mountain. Also, the formation of the crust is when you have the hot mantle coming from deep down, and then it rises up, and it melts and creating this crystal mush. Also, it forms two layers, the upper layer and the lower layer of the oceanic crust. When it becomes cooler and cooler, it will change from solid, liquid to solid, and at that time, it will record the magnetic field of that moment. And the interesting thing about the Earth's magnetic field is that the polarity changes from time to time. Right now, we have a normal polarity, but a long time ago, it is the reverse, and then also that repeated. So as you can imagine, when the oceanic crusts are continually forming, then it recorded this kind of switching from positive to negative polarity. So one example of the mid-oceanic ridge is that between the South America and Africa, and this one, the spreading rate is very slow. It's 1.7 meters per year. So we are not talking about crazily high, fast processing. It's very unnoticeable movement. And it also agree with observation. So underneath all the ocean, so this is the North Atlantic Ocean, and also the other ocean, the other area ocean, you can see this kind of striation that are parallel to the mid-oceanic ridge. So these are the recording tape for the magnetic field. And so wherever you have ocean, it's underlaid mostly by the oceanic crust. So you have just learned the little bits of pieces of plate tectonic. Now we want to upgrade and learn about the birth of an ocean, which is actually quite a simple story. So somehow the crust got pulled apart, and it have rifting of the continental crust occur, just like this. So this all this step means there is rifting, and because you have thinner crust in the middle, it subsided and allowed water to go in the middle, forming small ocean or lake. And somehow, with more extension, the two sides will break apart. So the breakup of the plate, just like here, and somehow the oceanic crust will start to form in the middle, between at the point where it break up. Okay, and we call this stage the drifting stage. Yeah, and if you have that happen for a long time, you have a mature ocean like the North Atlantic Ocean, and forming the passive margin, which is the Nova Scotia margin is the passive margin. But nothing is so far is very controversial, as long as you're okay with the somehow. But of course, scientists want to look into more detail of the matter, so there are some more debated issues. For example, what is the cause of extension? And there are two hypotheses. One is that it can be caused by a mantle plume going from deep down the mantle to the lower part of the base of the lithosphere, pretty much like what you observe in a lava lamp. So this, when it hit the bottom of the lithosphere, it kind of lifted the crust up a little bit, and because there are differences in elevation, so it kind of produced a pulling force along the side of the plume. So that is one way. And also when the plume hit the base of the crust, the lithosphere, it kind of has nowhere to go, so it has to spread out sideways, and that sideways motion also will be pulling the lithosphere and the crust apart as well. And another factor, another cause, I would say, that looks like when scientists don't want to explain it, they just say it is somewhere far away. It's a force that is somewhere far away, so far away that nobody knows exactly what causes. So it's as if God is pulling it somewhere. So it's the far-field forces, but one of the possible ways may be that because in the convergent margin, the slab, the oceanic lithosphere, will be sinking down underneath the continental block. So that will be pulling maybe, so that may have enough force to pull the continental plate apart. So that is one possibility. What I think is that it might be both together. Another question is, in what fashion did the plate extend it? So we want to think about how the rift to drift transition occur, how the rift change over to the drift. Yes. So I want to mention that rift and drift is only with a D that is different. So it's quite neat. So to understand what fashion, we need to look at the different style of deformation. Imagine you are pulling your elastic band like this one, and this curve describes the deformation under the force that you use to pull it. So when you apply just a small force, it is under elastic deformation. So when you pull it and then you release it, it will go back to its original shape, and that is a temporary deformation. But you probably experienced it if you overstretch it, then beyond a point, which we call the U point, okay, you know that you have ruined your elastic band. And if you release it, it will not go back to the original shape. It will be longer. And that is an inelastic deformation. It's a permanent deformation. And of course, if you pull it even more, then the result is that you break it. Okay, so that is this point. And for geological deformation, we only care about the inelastic deformation. So this curve describes the strength of the material. For my case, it's the rubber. But the strength also, so the strength is how easily you can deform the material. It is a function of many factors. So here are some factors, like the temperature. So the higher the temperature, it's more easy that you can deform it with smaller force. And with higher pressure, then you have to have larger force. It's stronger, becomes stronger, so you need a higher force to deform it. And also the strain rate matter as well. So how fast you pull the band also will change how much force you need to use to break it. The slower it is, the easier it is, actually. And the faster is the faster one, the larger is your force that is required. And also rock type is another factor. So you see there are many factors that can play into the strain, to decide the strain of the material. And so now you can appreciate how the real Earth situation would be very complicated, because we know that with depth, the temperature will increase, the pressure will increase. So the rheology of the crust and the mantle will increase. The strength of the crust and the mantle will be changing with depth. So you see the pink parts are the crust, and the green and blue are the mantle. It's likely that in the top of the upper part of the crust is the brittle part of the crust. So it's it undergo brittle deformation. It's like it breaks things into two. That's the brittle deformation, and is where we will have earthquake. The base of the crust is it becomes ductile. It's like you're bending an iron rod. You don't break them into two. It is where you will not detect any earthquake. Mantle is stronger than the crust, but it also is brittle at the top and ductile at the bottom. And another complication would be that this thickness is changing when you have rifting, when you have extension. So it is actually a very complicated process. So this causes us to wonder if this kind of simple cartoon for the formation of the ocean is just too simple. When we think about how did the crustal thinning change over to the formation of the new crust. People do produce conceptual model to explain the continental-ocean transition, with considering that the upper crust can be brittle, and the lower crust is ductile, and then the upper mantle is ductile. So you can see that conceptually, the upper part, when you thin it, it forms all these fault blocks. So faults, these are brittle deformation, and the lower part is the ductile, more smoothly changing when it's thin. And it's the same with the upper mantle. And because it's thinner, the harder part, the asthenosphere, become it intrude into the shallower part of the picture. And so with more extension, the upper crust, because it's brittle, it breaks into two, and with the lower crust being able to creep to the surface, and because it goes to the surface, the rheology changes well. It goes from ductile to brittle, and then eventually this also will be broken into two, and at the right time, the asthenosphere will rise to the surface and form melting and form oceanic crust. So for this scenario, the continental-ocean transition you will observe that there are some very thin upper crust, and then followed by lower crust, very thin lower crust, and then the oceanic crust. So this is like a cross section. Of course, you can suggest another scenario, which is that the lower crust is also brittle. So it's like this, like the one here, except that the lower crust also has this fault going all the way to the mole hole, and so together it breaks apart and exposes the mantle. So when the mantle is exposed, it can also become brittle and break apart with the and then the oceanic crust form in the middle. So for this scenario, you will predict different rock type for the continental-ocean transition, which is to the seaward of the continental crust. You also have extreme mantle. However, these are just from human imagination. Maybe a better way is really to use the computer to simulate what would have happened when the Earth is thin. So by using numerical model, you can do so. There are many numerical models. I choose this one because it comes from our own Chris Bowman from the Oceanography Department in Dalhousie. He developed this, and his postdoc Huysmans used it for studying rifted margin. And so to run this, you will have to provide many parameters and also many mathematical calculation formulas, and all of this we have to make sure that it will be as close to the real-life situation as possible, and then just have it started. And the prediction, it predicts very well, like what we have for the conceptual model. So like first, when you have a little amount rifting, you have fault blocks, so faulting, rifting, and then more ductile deformation at the lower part, and then more thinning, and at the end you have production of oceanic crust in the middle, when you have the hotter part of the mantle go way up to the surface. And because it is the like numerical model, you can also input some interesting feature, like a different kind of mantle material, and so this is just a fancy way of showing what can possibly happen. So if you run many models with many kind of possible scenario or parameter, this guy concluded that can be 3 different types of style of rifting. Of course, it is not the scope of this talk to really go into detail of each of this, but you can probably appreciate one thing is that there are so many possibilities that the numerical model can provide, but all it does is that it separates the possible from the impossible. So if it doesn't predict it, just don't worry about it. But if it predicted that, it doesn't necessarily mean that it really did happen. So we need to depend on field observation to know what actually happened. However, we can only make a present-day snapshot of the like what we see is just a present-day snapshot. We cannot go back to history and observe, especially when you're talking about 100 million years ago. We can only observe the crust and the sediment. We may be able to observe the mantle, but we know that it has already been changed from the time that the rift was formed, the margin was formed. And also we can study some quite well-preserved or thrust-up margin. Those are the continental ocean transition that are brought up to the surface because of the tectonic force. So it brought up to the mountain like the Alps. And of course, it has to be very well preserved in order for us to study. And also, it's good to study the modern margin, although they are covered underneath the ocean. For example, the Atlantic Ocean margin, including the Nova Scotia margins that we have. The technique to use is the seismic imaging. It's kind of like ultrasound, doing ultrasound of the subsurface. Or we can drill into the subsurface and get core from it. And according to the observation, we can see there are 2 different types of transition. And one is the magma-rich, we call it volcanic margin, and the other one is magma-poor or non-volcanic margin. So which one are better for studying it? So this one is the magma-rich margin. Again, you have this thick crust here that is rifted, and then on this side it is the oceanic crust. But in the middle, it kind of get contamination by magma. Okay, to me, it's almost like a magician's cage. So the magician put the rifted continental crust in the cage and then cover it with magma, the cloth, and then after uncovering the cloth, taking away the cloth, then you become the drift. So you don't really know what is behind the cloth of the magma. So I don't think it's very suitable for studying the mechanism of the rift to drift transition. And so, but it is not so for the magma-poor margin, because theoretically you should be able to see everything. You should be able to observe the part where you have very thin crust, and perhaps you can observe where the mantle get exhumed, like exposed to the sea floor, and then you have oceanic crust. So I think it's a better option, and that is what I study. So where are the volcanic and non-volcanic transition? So the yellow ones are where you can observe non-volcanic margins, and the green ones are where you have volcanic margin. Nova Scotia is kind of in between them, so it is interesting to see how far the yellow go into the box and how far the red go up into the box. So this is one very interesting research as well. The same happened to the other side of the Atlantic along the European plate. So if you want to know how the opening of the Atlantic is like, so this shows you how it works. So 180 million years ago, so not very long time ago, the Nova Scotia face to face with Africa, and Newfoundland with Iberia and Spain. So all of these are together. And then 50 million years later, this part opened up so that Nova Scotia gets separated from Africa, but still Newfoundland is right next to Spain and Iberia. And then 80 million years ago, the ocean kind of branched into the Labrador Sea, so up here, and separating Newfoundland, and so this is the more like the Orphan Basin. So, so going to here to separate Newfoundland from England and Ireland, and 50 million years ago, also the opening spread into the Labrador Sea, and also between, so here between Greenland and Norway. And finally, this is the present configuration. Okay, I know that the last thing you wanted to do on a Monday night is to learn how to read seismic section. So you have to take my word of what I explain, what I see from these seismic sections. The color is the seismic velocity. It tells you about the rock type. And the black pattern is the ultrasounds, the black and white ultrasounds that you may have seen. So you can see that the yellow is the crust. The yellow and the orange is the crust. So it's very thick at the leftmost part, and then it becomes thinner to the right, and that is the continental crust. It becomes thinner and thinner, and as it is becoming thinner, the surface will subside and giving way to have sediment and also water. And on this side, you have oceanic crust, which is the new crust, and also has thin thickness, so a small thickness. But in the middle is the transitional. It looks somewhat like the oceanic crust, but then you also have this strange region where the mantle seems to go very near to the surface. So we call this the partially serpentinized mantle, which is the same as mantle, but because it have contact with the water, so it become a serpentinized instead of pure peridotite. So that one was I think from the central Scotian margin, and that is the further to the north. The same thing, so here it already thinned quite a bit, but it thinned very rapidly here, and that is the continental crust all the way to here. And on that side is the oceanic crust, and in the middle, there is something that is very hard to interpret whether it is oceanic crust or continental crust, and the person who works on it thinks that it might be a mantle that goes all the way to the top. So this is actually from my PhD thesis. This is the Southern Newfoundland Basin. So this shows more clearly the thinning, the rifting of the crust to very thin thickness. And this is the oceanic crust there. And in the middle also there's this unknown, uncertain region, whether it is oceanic crust or continental crust or whatever, it is kind of hard. And I think what I propose that it can either be oceanic crust that are very thin, or it is a mantle that exhumed to the surface while the margin was formed. And that we have more certainty. So this is northern Newfoundland Basin. We have more certainty that the transition zone is composed of very, very thin oceanic crust. But also there are part that has some mantle that is being serpentinized. We can also drill into the place that we think is the transition. Okay, and the core, this is one of the examples of the core segment, and it shows us the mixture of crust and mantle fragment. And another part of the core, it shows us the serpentinites, which is the mantle rock. So we have, seems to have everything. Of course, you can also go to Alps and look at the rock on land, and so this is the part where the continent-ocean transition is brought to the land. This is an example of exposed mantle. The reason why they think it's exposed is because they observe sediment going right under, above, have a direct contact with the mantle. And of course, they make a lot more observation, and this is kind of like a explanation figure of what they found. So just focus on the lower part. They found that on the Alps is like this. So this is the Alps again. So you have rifted crust here, thinning to very thin, zero thickness. But then you can still have some smaller block of continental crust left. In between those blocks, you may have mantle, and then this is the most interesting part is the embryonic oceanic crust. So it seems like the margin wanted to go to the stage of forming oceanic crust, but wasn't sure quite how to do it. So it's kind of forming something that looks like oceanic crust, very thin, looking like it, but not quite. And I would say that it looks like the transition is like a messy mix of everything. So this is, I think, the best picture I can find to illustrate what we see in the continental ocean transition. So under hyperextension, you have a region that is a mixture of everything. For example, you have a train of continental block, or you have alto mantle, either it is being covered or that is exhumed, or it can be melt, or it can be very small scale embryonic oceanic crust. Again, it is as if the drifting mode wanted to start, and it started, and it probably stopped, and just trying to figure out how to really become truly drifting mode. And this stage is terminated by the formation of full-term oceanic crust. So as soon as oceanic crust is being formed, then there will be no more rifting and formation of the continent-ocean transition. So that means that we actually don't have a transitional crust that physically exists. So there's nothing that is a transitional crust. It's either maybe a little bit of continental crust, or a little bit of exhumantal, and a little bit of embryonic oceanic crust. Of course, what I have just talked about has a lot of scientific implication, but for this talk, I want to focus on the accretion implication. So for the more general implication that applies to all scientific finding, probably for most of us, you will experience uplifted by having the mystery solved, right? And you will feel amazed by the complexity of the nature, and you probably feel very thrilled by finding a good news story. And you probably feel humble because you think I just know so little. Or you'll be encouraged to make more discovery. But for Christian, as a Christian, I don't just stop there. I have even more spiritual implication. Because for me, I feel that I can bring both the passion for science and the passion for God together. And the understanding of how God created nature as well. So I can get a better understanding of God's creation and how He created it. And if I have a loving relationship with God, it is almost also like knowing someone from His work. And when I look at the margin structure, I receive it as like a gift of love. And also God wants His work to be known, right? And I believe that He will guide me to do it. And of course, God is pleased when I do that, because no one wants to create something, especially in a very fancy way. No one wants to not be known about it, right? In other words, more research will lead to more worship of God. But it's also interesting to apply the more research-specific result. To have more research-specific implication to my Christian faith, because like Jesus, He often used surrounding example to explain His point. For example, like the seed sown to different environment, like the dry path, like the rocky path. He used it to explain why some people will follow the teaching of the Scripture and while others don't. So for me, what would be the specific implication, the Christian parallel of the extended margin story? So let me start with the initial stage. We have the original thick continental crust in the middle of a plate. So that's it, right? And that is comparable to when before we become a Christian. That is the time when we do not see the need to believe in Jesus, and we're hoping to be like this forever. And the old spiritual nature and the old way of living were very much intact. So what I mean by old is that I refer to the impure character. For example, according to the Galatians chapter 5, verse 9 to 11, for example, the sexual immorality, impurity, and so and so. Just like for crust, you have the brittle, ductile, and we have all this old nature. If you think that you didn't have those character, maybe I add one more, is the self-righteousness. And I also want to jump to the end stage, the final stage. Instead of talking about the middle, I want to go from the initial to the final stage. And that is the continuous generation of new oceanic crust, the drift stage. So this is the time when we are living an eternal life. And that is after the resurrection of the body into a new heaven and earth. And I call it the new era in my topic, so that's what I mean. And for more biblical term would be the coming age. And that is when this new spiritual nature and the new way of living maturely develop. And new, I refer to the Christ-like or holy characters. And this scripture describes it: the love, joy, peace, forbearance, or patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, being the character of the oceanic crust. And also to resume the role of royal priesthood, which is taken from the 1 Peter 2:9. It means that we have kind of a double identity. We become both a ruler of the world and also to serve God as well. So that is the role that God wants us to have from the very beginning, and we kind of resume it. So we have seen the initial stage. How can we jump from the initial stage to the final stage? And we have learned this, right? And the first thing is to go to the engagement stage. This is like the rifting, when the rifting started, and that is the time when we accepted Jesus. And after that is the transitional stage. That is the formation of the continent-ocean transition. And for the Christian parallel, it is the continual transformation of accretion. So let's go into the detail of the engagement stage. So it is when the continental crust first started rifting. So you remember what causes it to start. These are the forces, right? Yeah, it's the moment when one accepted Jesus. It's kind of like you yielding to the external far-field forces from the Father God. So far-field forces here, and the close-up forces from the Holy Spirit. So, like this. And that force is so big, you have to yield. And you make the first step, like forming a half graben. So this is actually from numerical model. The result is that when you put it with a very large force, then it will first form, what first form is force, that is 45 degrees. So that is the first step, and you make a little bit of deformation. So nothing might be very noticeably changed at the beginning, but you know that it has been changed. But more change will come, just like our rifted crust. Okay, so that is the transitional stage, the continent-ocean transition. There will be more steps that you will make in your spiritual journey, like baptism, read the Bible, praying, worship, serve the God, and so and so. It's kind of like a tectonic destruction of the old nature for you to become more and more holy. And then the lake started to form. So you kind of produce something that looks like new life. But it's lake, it's not ocean yet. So Christendom immediately become perfect and holy. But we know that the transition is going in the right direction towards the final goal. And we also see the messy mix, right? Here, we know that even for mature student, mature believer, we can be in the kind of messy mix because it's kind of like training. Sometimes we can be off guard and let the old nature take over us. And sometimes, even though when you know that you're very spiritual, then you become arrogant and because you are feeling that you're better than everyone. But of course, God will also guide you to repentance. You repent, and then you go back on track. So in general, you are still on the right track, progressing toward what you should be. And sometimes you just don't know. You may be already very close to perfect. And this stage will end when we die. So when we die, we go to the final stage, which is the new era. And because we have this engagement stage, I want to rename the final stage to wedding stage. And that is also mentioned in the Bible. So in conclusion, I want to have kind of some statement of what I agree and what I disagree. So what I agree is that it is more likely to find common ground between science and religion and to feel them as complementing one another for further understanding of the universe. And what I disagree is that it is more likely to find conflicts between science and religion and only one side will win. And I agree that just as the nature takes a transitional approach from rift to drift, we Christians also experience a transition from the old to the new spiritual nature that would last for the whole lifetime after accepting Jesus. And here some people, usually they are non-Christian, they would expect that Christians should be perfect from day one, but I don't agree with it. Or there are other people, mostly Christian, that would think that any effort in pursuing holiness are a waste of time because we are guaranteed to get there after death. Instead, I think Christians should be reminded more of the importance of practicing good religion to cultivate more Christ-like character sooner than later. So that's it. Thank you so much for coming and support me, because being a geoscientist is not easy. You always get misunderstood, like what this slide is suggesting. And it's even harder to be a Christian and a geoscientist, to get even more misunderstood. Thank you.